The story begins on an unremarkable evening in early spring with Mary, a 21-year-old college student, spending time at a local bar near campus. Mary was a business major, struggling with the typical financial pressures of student life. Student loans, rent, and everyday expenses weighed heavily on her. To unwind, she often spent evenings at the bar with her close friend and classmate, Richard. Richard was from a wealthy family, something he didn't often discuss, but it was evident in his lifestyle and the ease with which he approached his finances. That night, the atmosphere in the bar was lively, with a mix of students and locals enjoying drinks and music. Mary and Richard were seated at a corner table, their usual spot, sharing drinks and casual conversation. As the night wore on, Richard, who was usually more reserved, became increasingly intoxicated. His speech grew looser, and he began to share stories and details about his life that he would normally keep private. As Richard rambled on, he began to talk about his family, particularly his grandmother, Penelope. At 62 years old, Penelope was a wealthy woman with a significant estate and various business interests, including a successful flower business. Richard mentioned, with a drunken chuckle, that his grandmother led a hidden life, far removed from the respectable image she maintained publicly. According to Richard, Penelope had a penchant for seducing young women, a secret that few people knew about. He described her as a powerful, charismatic woman who enjoyed the thrill of these secretive relationships. Richard laughed it off as harmless gossip, something amusing to share in his inebriated state. However, for Mary, this information was anything but trivial. She was immediately intrigued by the possibilities that this revelation presented. Struggling with her own financial insecurities, Mary couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to turn this information to her advantage. The idea of a wealthy older woman who could be charmed and potentially manipulated into providing financial support began to take root in her mind. As Richard continued to laugh and drink, Mary's mind was already racing, considering how she might meet Penelope and what she could potentially gain from such an encounter. After that fateful night at the bar, Mary found herself unable to stop thinking about Penelope and the potential opportunity that had just presented itself. The idea of gaining access to wealth without the years of hard work and struggle typically required in the real world became an obsession. The prospect of a rich, older woman who might be easily swayed by youthful beauty and charm seemed like a lifeline, an escape from the suffocating reality she faced every day. Mary began to research Penelope. She spent hours online, trying to gather as much information as possible about the older woman. What she found only fueled her determination. Penelope was indeed wealthy, owning several properties, including a grand mansion on the outskirts of town. Her flower business was thriving, and she was known to be a patron of the arts, often seen at charity events and galas. However, there was little to no public information about Penelope's personal life, especially regarding her alleged affairs with younger women. This only added to the mystique surrounding her and made Mary even more curious. The more Mary learned, the more she was convinced that she could manipulate the situation to her advantage. Penelope's life seemed perfectly poised for someone like Mary to step in and exploit her loneliness or desire for companionship. But Mary knew she had to be careful. Penelope was no fool. She was a woman of power and influence, someone who had likely dealt with many people trying to take advantage of her over the years. Mary would have to play her cards perfectly if she were to succeed. Determined to set her plan in motion, Mary decided to reach out to Richard. She needed a plausible reason to meet Penelope, something that wouldn't raise his suspicions. After considering various approaches, she settled on a story that seemed both believable and in line with her situation. She would tell Richard that she was struggling with her studies and financial situation, and that she had heard about his grandmother's successful flower business. Mary would express a genuine interest in learning more about the business, perhaps even working there part-time, under the guise of seeking advice from a successful entrepreneur like Penelope. With her plan in place, Mary called Richard the following week. She casually brought up their conversation from the bar. reminding him of what he had mentioned about his grandmother. Richard, who had only vague recollections of that night, laughed it off. But Mary persisted. Richard, unaware of Mary's ulterior motives, was more than willing to help. He had always seen Mary as a good friend, someone who was genuine and hardworking. He thought nothing of her request, seeing it as a normal response to the pressures of college life. He agreed to set up a meeting, assuring Mary that his grandmother would be happy to meet her and offer whatever help she could. As they finalized the details, Mary felt a surge of excitement and anxiety. This was it, the first step in a plan that could change her life forever. She knew she had to be cautious, to play her role perfectly, and to keep her true intentions hidden. But if she could pull it off, the rewards could be enormous. When the day of the meeting finally arrived, Mary made sure to dress appropriately, choosing an outfit that was both modest and subtly flattering. She knew that she needed to appeal to Penelope on multiple levels, as a young woman in need of guidance, as a potential protégé, and as an object of desire. She opted for a simple dress that highlighted her figure without being overtly suggestive, aiming for a balance that would draw Penelope in without raising suspicions about her true intentions. Richard picked Mary up in his car that afternoon, and as they drove to Penelope's mansion, he casually chatted about his grandmother. He spoke about how Penelope was a strong, independent woman who had built her flower business from the ground up after inheriting a small sum from her late husband. Richard mentioned that Penelope had a sharp mind for business and that she was known for her tough, no-nonsense approach. But beneath that exterior, Richard claimed, Penelope had a soft spot for those she cared about. When they arrived at the mansion, Mary felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Richard led her to the front door and rang the bell. A housekeeper answered, leading them into an elegant sitting room where Penelope awaited them. The room was richly decorated with expensive furniture, art pieces on the walls, and a large fireplace that added warmth to the space. Penelope, seated in a high-backed chair, stood as they entered. She was an imposing figure, dressed in a tailored suit, her silver hair styled perfectly, and her piercing blue eyes immediately locking onto Mary. Richard introduced Mary, explaining her interest in the flower business and her desire to learn from someone as successful as Penelope. Mary offered a polite smile and shook Penelope's hand, noting the firmness of her grip and the way her eyes seemed to assess every detail of her appearance. Richard, unaware of Mary's ulterior motives, was more than willing to help. He had always seen Mary as a good friend, someone who was genuine and hardworking. He thought nothing of her request, seeing it as a normal response to the pressures of college life. He agreed to set up a meeting, assuring Mary that his grandmother would be happy to meet her and offer whatever help she could. As they finalized the details, Mary felt a surge of excitement and anxiety. This was it, the first step in a plan that could change her life forever. She knew she had to be cautious, to play her role perfectly, and to keep her true intentions hidden. But if she could pull it off, the rewards could be enormous. When the day of the meeting finally arrived, Mary made sure to dress appropriately, choosing an outfit that was both modest and subtly flattering. She knew that she needed to appeal to Penelope on multiple levels, as a young woman in need of guidance, as a potential protégé, and as an object of desire. She opted for a simple dress that highlighted her figure without being overtly suggestive, aiming for a balance that would draw Penelope in without raising suspicions about her true intentions. Richard picked Mary up in his car that afternoon, and as they drove to Penelope's mansion, he casually chatted about his grandmother. He spoke about how Penelope was a strong, independent woman who had built her flower business from the ground up after inheriting a small sum from her late husband. Richard mentioned that Penelope had a sharp mind for business and that she was known for her tough, no-nonsense approach. But beneath that exterior, Richard claimed, Penelope had a soft spot for those she cared about. When they arrived at the mansion, Mary felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Richard led her to the front door and rang the bell. A housekeeper answered, leading them into an elegant sitting room where Penelope awaited them. The room was richly decorated with expensive furniture, art pieces on the walls, and a large fireplace that added warmth to the space. Penelope, in the study, a more intimate space filled with bookshelves, plush chairs, and a large desk, Penelope seemed to relax even further. She offered Mary a drink, which she accepted, and the two women continued their conversation. Mary could feel Penelope's interest growing, and she knew that she was on the right track. She was careful to maintain the right balance of vulnerability and charm, not wanting to come on too strong, but also making it clear that she was open to whatever Penelope might suggest. By the time they finished their drinks, Mary could tell that Penelope was intrigued. The older woman had started to touch Mary's arm lightly during the conversation, a subtle but telling gesture that indicated she was becoming more comfortable with her. Mary responded with slight touches of her own, testing the waters and finding that Penelope did not pull away. As the afternoon turned to evening, Penelope suggested that Mary stay for dinner. Mary agreed, inwardly pleased that things were progressing even faster than she had anticipated. During dinner, the flirtation became more overt, with Penelope complimenting Mary on her appearance and intelligence. Mary reciprocated, complimenting Penelope on her success and expressing how much she admired her. By the end of the evening, it was clear that Penelope was more than just interested in Mary. She was captivated. As Mary left the mansion that night, Penelope insisted on seeing her again, and Mary knew that she had successfully initiated the next phase of her plan. In the days following their initial meeting, Penelope found herself thinking about Mary more often than she had anticipated. There was something about the young woman that intrigued her, a combination of vulnerability and confidence that was both endearing and seductive. Penelope, who had been through numerous short-lived affairs with young women over the years, usually kept her emotions in check. But with Mary, there was a spark that she hadn't felt in a long time. She decided to act on it. Penelope reached out to Richard, suggesting that Mary come over again, this time without him. She framed it as an opportunity for Mary to discuss potential job opportunities more privately, knowing that Richard would think nothing of it. Richard, still unaware of his grandmother's intentions, agreed without hesitation and passed the message on to Mary. Mary, who had been eagerly awaiting this opportunity, immediately accepted the invitation. She understood that this was a significant step in her plan. If she could deepen the connection with Penelope, she would be one step closer to accessing the wealth and security she so desperately craved. She prepared herself carefully for the meeting, choosing her outfit with care, something that would make her appear both sophisticated and alluring. When Mary arrived at Penelope's mansion, she was greeted by the housekeeper, who led her to Penelope's private quarters, a more intimate and personal space than where they had met before. The room was richly decorated with dark wood furniture, luxurious drapes, and soft lighting that gave it a warm, inviting atmosphere. Penelope was waiting for her, dressed elegantly in a tailored outfit that accentuated her still attractive figure. Penelope welcomed Mary with a smile and a light touch on her arm, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by Mary. As they settled into the room, Penelope offered her a drink, and they made small talk for a while, discussing inconsequential topics. But there was an underlying tension in the air, a sense that both women knew there was more at play than just a friendly visit. After some time, Penelope turned the conversation towards the reason for Mary's visit. She asked Mary if she was still interested in working within her flower business, suggesting that there could be a place for someone like her, a bright, young woman with potential. Mary, knowing exactly where this conversation was leading, responded positively, expressing her eagerness to learn from someone as successful as Penelope. But Penelope, always perceptive, could sense that there was more to Mary's eagerness. She had noticed the way Mary looked at her, the subtle flirtations that had been exchanged during their first meeting. Deciding to test the waters, Penelope moved closer to Mary, standing behind her as she sat in a chair. She began to gently knead Mary's shoulders, ostensibly as a gesture of comfort, but the intimacy of the touch suggested more. Mary, who had anticipated this moment, leaned into the touch slightly, signaling her acceptance. She knew that this was the point of no return, the moment where her plan would either succeed or fail. When Penelope began to speak, her voice was low and suggestive, asking Mary if she was truly willing to do whatever it took to succeed. The implication was clear, and Mary didn't hesitate. She responded by reaching up and taking Penelope's hand, guiding it down to her chest and slipping it inside her bra. Penelope was taken aback by the boldness of the move, but it only fueled her desire. She hadn't expected Mary to be so forward, but it excited her. She leaned down, whispering into Mary's ear, her breath hot against her skin. The tension in the room escalated quickly, and within moments, the two women were locked in a passionate embrace, their hands exploring each other's bodies with a hunger that had been building since their first meeting. The encounter was intense and left both women breathless. Penelope, still in a state of disbelief at how easily Mary had succumbed to her advances, was now fully captivated by the young woman. She saw in Mary a beauty and passion that reignited her own sense of youth and vitality. Penelope's attraction to Mary was no longer just a fleeting interest. It was quickly becoming an obsession. As they parted later that evening, Penelope made it clear that she wanted to see Mary again, and soon. Mary, playing her role to perfection, agreed, making sure to leave Penelope wanting more. She understood that the key to maintaining Penelope's interest was to balance availability with a hint of unattainability, keeping the older woman always eager for their next encounter. As the weeks went by, the affair between Mary and Penelope deepened. What began as a calculated seduction on Mary's part quickly escalated into a full-blown relationship, with Penelope showering Mary with attention, gifts, and financial support. Penelope, enamored by Mary's youth and beauty, spared no expense in spoiling her new lover. Expensive jewelry, designer clothes, and luxurious outings became regular occurrences. Penelope enjoyed the thrill of the affair, feeling rejuvenated by Mary's presence in her life. Mary, for her part, played the role of the devoted girlfriend to perfection. She knew exactly how to stroke Penelope's ego, making the older woman feel desirable and appreciated. Mary would listen intently as Penelope shared stories of her past, always knowing when to offer a compliment or a flirtatious remark to keep the mood light and romantic. Yet, despite the outward appearances of a passionate love affair, the truth was that Mary was simply going through the motions. She had no genuine feelings for Penelope. Everything she did was motivated by her desire for financial security. She knew that as long as Penelope believed in their relationship, she would continue to benefit from the older woman's wealth. One of the ways Mary ensured Penelope's continued interest was by indulging in the older woman's every desire. Penelope had a vivid imagination and a penchant for intimate fantasies, many of which Mary found difficult to stomach. But Mary knew that in order to keep Penelope satisfied, she had to play along. Penelope, accustomed to fleeting affairs and the thrill of the chase, began to treat Mary with a sense of detachment. The lavish gifts that once flowed freely started to dwindle. The expensive jewelry, designer clothes, and luxurious outings that Mary had grown accustomed to became less frequent. Instead of the constant attention and affection she had once received, Mary now found herself being treated more like a passing fancy than a cherished partner. Mary, who had meticulously planned every step of her seduction, was quick to recognize the signs. Penelope's shift in behavior wasn't just about growing boredom. It was also about control. Penelope had always been the dominant force in their relationship, and as her interest waned, she began to reassert that dominance by pulling back and testing Mary's reactions. For Mary, this was a dangerous development. She knew that if Penelope fully lost interest, her chances of securing any lasting financial benefit would disappear along with it. Sensing the growing distance, Mary tried to reignite Penelope's interest. She became more attentive, more affectionate, and more willing to indulge Penelope's desires, no matter how uncomfortable it made her. Mary was determined to maintain her position in Penelope's life and ensure that the financial benefits continued to flow. However, despite her efforts, she could feel Penelope slipping away. As the relationship continued to deteriorate, Mary's thoughts turned darker. She knew that she couldn't afford to wait much longer. Penelope's interest was fading, and with it, Mary's chances of securing a lasting financial arrangement. Desperation began to cloud her judgment, and she started to consider more drastic measures. Mary had always been a pragmatist, willing to do whatever it took to get what she wanted. Now, faced with the possibility of losing everything, she began to contemplate actions that she had never before considered. Mary's growing sense of urgency drove her to think of a plan that would allow her to leave Penelope's life on her own terms, but not before taking what she felt she was owed. She knew that if she was going to walk away from this relationship, she needed to do so with enough money and valuables to secure her future. Penelope's mansion was filled with priceless items, and Mary had spent enough time there to know where the most valuable pieces were kept. If Penelope was no longer willing to give her what she wanted, Mary would simply have to take it. Mary could sense that the older woman was on the verge of moving on entirely. Determined not to let this happen, Mary devised a plan that would allow her to leave Penelope's life with a significant payoff. She knew it was risky, but her situation left her little choice. If Penelope was going to discard her like so many others before, Mary would make sure she took what she could before it was too late. The plan she came up with was simple but fraught with danger. She would rob Penelope during one final visit, taking whatever valuables she could carry and disappearing into the night. Mary knew the layout of Penelope's mansion intimately, and she was confident that she could make off with enough to secure her future. Mary began to put her plan into action by calling Penelope and setting up what she intended to be their last encounter. She knew that Penelope still had a lingering attraction to her, despite the fading interest, and she decided to use that to her advantage. Over the phone, Mary played into Penelope's desires, telling her how much she wanted to see her again, how she missed their time together, and how she wanted to be her toy, completely submissive to her wishes. The words were calculated to reignite the spark that had initially drawn Penelope to her. Penelope, despite her waning interest, found herself intrigued by Mary's sudden display of submissiveness. The idea of one last passionate encounter appealed to her, and she readily agreed to meet. The evening began as usual, with the two women enjoying wine and flirtatious banter. Penelope was charmed by Mary's apparent eagerness to please, unaware of the true intentions behind it. As the evening progressed, Penelope led Mary to the bedroom, where their usual intimacy resumed. The old woman's fantasies were incredible. According to Mary's testimony, Penelope was obsessed with BDSM and domination. She forced Mary to play the role of an innocent girl who was ready for anything, and Mary herself was a mistress who forced Mary to be intimate. As Penelope eventually drifted off to sleep, satisfied and unsuspecting, Mary's real work began. She had prepared for this moment meticulously, knowing that timing and stealth were crucial. She waited until she was sure that Penelope was deep asleep, then carefully slipped out of bed and began her quiet theft. Mary knew exactly where Penelope kept her most valuable possessions. She had observed the older woman's habits and knew where to find the hidden jewelry, cash, and other valuables that could easily be turned into money. As Mary was about to finish her theft, Penelope suddenly stirred and woke up. She immediately sensed that something was wrong. Her eyes darted around the room, and she quickly realized that Mary was not in bed. Penelope quietly observed Mary as she moved about the room, gathering valuables. When Penelope saw Mary stuffing jewelry and cash into a bag, her suspicions were confirmed. Rage boiled within her as she realized that Mary had been using her all along. Without warning, Penelope sat up in bed and demanded to know what Mary was doing. The sudden confrontation caught Mary off guard. Panic surged through her as she realized that she had been caught in the act. She tried to stammer out an excuse, but Penelope was having none of it. Penelope's anger was palpable as she threatened to call the police and have Mary arrested for theft and breaking and entering. The older woman was livid at the betrayal and was determined to see Mary punished. She reached for her phone to call the authorities, but before she could dial, Mary's desperation took over. In a split second, Mary realized that if Penelope called the police, her life would be over. Driven by sheer panic, Mary lunged at Penelope to stop her from making the call. In the struggle, Penelope turned her back for a moment to reach for the phone on the bedside table. In that instant, Mary's eyes fell on a statue of David that Penelope kept on a nearby shelf, a heavy, ornate piece that could easily be used as a weapon. Acting on impulse and fear, Mary grabbed the statue and, with all her strength, struck Penelope on the head. The blow was forceful and immediate. Penelope staggered, then collapsed to the floor, blood pouring from the wound on her head. She lay there, unconscious, her phone clattering to the ground beside her. For a moment, the room was filled with a deafening silence as Mary stood there, frozen in shock at what she had just done. The realization of her actions hit her like a tidal wave. She had just assaulted Penelope, possibly fatally. Mary's mind raced as she tried to process what had happened. She knew she couldn't stay there any longer. She had to cover her tracks and get out as quickly as possible. In a daze, Mary wiped her fingerprints from the statue and threw it near Penelope's lifeless body. Desperation driving her every move, she grabbed a cooking hammer from the kitchen and used it to break the glass on the front door, simulating a forced entry to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. With adrenaline coursing through her veins, Mary grabbed the bag of valuables and fled the mansion, leaving Penelope lying unconscious and bleeding on the floor. She was careful to avoid being seen as she made her way out of the estate and disappeared into the night. Mary knew that she had to get as far away as possible before anyone discovered what had happened. She was banking on the hope that by the time Penelope was found, she would be long gone, and Penelope would be too ashamed or too incapacitated to report the incident. The next day, Penelope was found in her mansion by a business partner who had come by for a previously scheduled meeting. Her car was parked in the driveway, but there was no answer at the door, and repeated calls to her phone went unanswered. Alarmed, the partner noticed the broken glass on the front door, which immediately heightened his concern. He hesitated for only a moment before dialing 911, reporting a possible break-in and expressing fear for Penelope's safety. When the police arrived, they forced their way into the house and quickly discovered the scene in the bedroom. Penelope was lying on the floor, unconscious, with a significant head injury. Blood had pooled around her, and she was unresponsive. The officers immediately called for an ambulance, and Penelope was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. It was clear to the first responders that she had been the victim of a violent assault. As the investigation began, detectives meticulously combed through the mansion for evidence. The broken glass on the front door suggested a burglary, but the scene inside raised questions. The detectives noted the statue of David, smeared with blood, lying on the floor near Penelope, a clear indication of the weapon used in the attack. However, what Mary had not accounted for were the security cameras installed throughout Penelope's mansion. Although Mary had wiped her fingerprints from the statue and simulated a break-in, she had overlooked the fact that Penelope, ever security conscious due to her wealth, had a sophisticated surveillance system in place. The cameras captured everything, from the moment Mary entered the house to the attack itself. Once the police reviewed the footage, they quickly identified Mary as the assailant. The recordings provided indisputable evidence of Mary's actions, capturing her movements throughout the house and the brutal moment she struck Penelope. With this critical evidence in hand, the police launched a manhunt for Mary. They traced her last known whereabouts and quickly realized she had fled the state. However, Mary's efforts to disappear were in vain. Using surveillance footage from various locations and tracking her movements, the authorities were able to locate her in a neighboring state. She was apprehended without incident, found hiding in a cheap motel, the bag of stolen valuables still in her possession. Mary was immediately arrested and charged with first-degree murder and attempted theft. The trial that followed was swift, given the overwhelming evidence against Mary. The prosecution presented the security footage as the centerpiece of their case, which left no doubt about Mary's guilt. Her defense tried to argue that she had acted out of fear and desperation, But this did little to sway the jury. The cold, calculated nature of her actions was laid bare for all to see, and the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Mary was sentenced to 11 years in prison.